Given much of what I've seen in modern philosophy, one of the questions I've learned to ask is, what about other people? Back in the 17th century, Rene Descartes was on a quest for certainty. He latched onto the strategy of methodic doubt. He'd doubt everything he could doubt and see if there was anything he couldn't doubt. He quickly discovered that he could doubt the deliverances of his senses. He could be dreaming. He could doubt God. It could just be his imagination or wish fulfillment. Eventually, he found something he couldn't doubt, that he was doubting. There must be some I, some self that was doing the doubting, that was engaged in the thinking process that constituted doubt. His famous conclusion was, I think, therefore I am. Once he had established his own existence, he was able to build a noetic structure on that secure foundation, giving him back God and the deliverances of his senses. That method of securing knowledge through building on an indubitable foundation was adequate for Descartes. Later generations of modern philosophers weren't as satisfied with the results. Some, often characterized as rationalists, stuck closer to Descartes' methods. Others, usually characterized as empiricists, identified sense data or experience as the sure foundation upon which they could build their system of knowledge. The problem for all of them was twofold. First, the indubitable foundation usually didn't prove as indubitable as they had originally thought. Second, they repeatedly found reasons to question the methods of building on that indubitable foundation. As the foundationalist metaphor that ruled modern epistemology showed cracks and crumbled, they were left with two choices. They could come to rest in skepticism, adopting the position that no knowledge was possible. The best we could do was some form of relativism or subjectivism. What purports to be knowledge is really only an ever opinion. At its most extreme, this approach led to solipsism, the belief that if there is any reality outside our head, we can never really know anything about it. But they had another option. They could decide that the foundationalist metaphor and even the quest for certainty that produced it was misguided. There is real knowledge, but that knowledge is not best understood in terms of indubitable foundation and noetic superstructure built upon it. In the face of all this, I'm inclined to ask, what about other people? At its most basic point, the quest for certainty and the foundationalist proposal is based on thinking. But how do we think? What is happening in our minds while we're thinking? Try it. Do you hear words in your mind? Are your thoughts in words, in language? Where do those words come from? Where does the language come from? One thing Descartes missed was that his action of doubting depended on his being embedded in a linguistic community that gave him the language and tools to seek certainty, to even think it was a goal worth pursuing. Here in chapter 7, Pincoffs confronts a challenge from those who think his ethical model might be giving insufficient attention to other people. On page 115, he says of his critics, the implication is that to follow a personal moral ideal and to measure one's moral progress against it must constitute a form of narcissistic selfishness, a turning away from one's moral ties to others. It is to imply that the very adoption of a personal moral ideal is morally questionable, leading to undue preoccupation with one's own development, a kind of moral preening where one should simply be doing what is right because one has an obligation to do so. These critics think Pincoffs is proposing a purely individualistic project, as if he were saying, I have a high personal ideal. The goal of my ethical life is to pursue and fully instantiate this personal ideal. They hear that supposed reasoning as a denial of the significance of other people. We need to be caring and compassionate, centered on others, they would say. In this chapter, Pincoffs defends himself against that charge and makes a case for the connection with the so-called personal ideal and life in ethical community. On page 116, Pincoffs observes, a moral problem can as well concern conflicts among one's ideals, between one's ideals and one's duties, as it can concern the question of what one's duties and obligations are. This is an important observation. Previously in the book, Pincoffs has noted that we have personal ideals. We want to be a particular kind of person, expressed in terms of those ideals. Those ideals are not the same thing as our duties, both the duties that we take ourselves to have and the duties we have whether we have discovered them or not. Our ideals are related to our duties. Part of my personal ideal, for example, includes convictions about who I am and what I should do as I live out my duties as, say, a husband and as a father. Sometimes my ideals and my duties work together nicely. I can live my life with no conflicts. Other times I experience a conflict. It might be that one set of duties that are tied to one of my roles in life come into conflict with another set of duties that might be tied to another role I fill. It can also be that of the ideal I hold. I discover occasions where these ideals don't seem to be compatible with each other. It's not just with reference to the physical world that I can't have it all. What are some experiences you've had in this regard? Have you become sufficiently aware of your ideals so as to notice when some are incompatible with others? You might also notice something more pleasurable, occasions where one set of ideals you hold makes living by another set easier, not harder or impossible. You've noticed that in this chapter, Pincoffs is drawing his illustrative material from the life of Gandhi. And no, the picture on this slide is not Gandhi, that's Ayn Rand, that we'll get to in just a moment. What are some things you're learning about Gandhi's life? How is what you're learning aiding in your learning of ethics? On page 123, Pincoffs deals with accusations of selfishness. He writes, to be selfish, one must look out for one's own interest to the detriment of the interests of others. Ayn Rand practices sophistry when she asserts on the first page of the introduction to The Virtue of Selfishness that the exact meaning and dictionary definition of the word selfishness is concern with one's own interest. Ayn Rand, a Russian immigrant to the US, is a founder of one of the current strands of libertarianism. She, as you might suppose from the title of her book mentioned by Pincoffs, saw selfishness as a virtue. When we try to act in a way that benefits others, she thought, we rob them of their independence and responsibility. Pincoffs argues with her on this. On his account, selfishness isn't benign self-interest, which is a natural part of ethical human life, but is looking out for one's own interest to the detriment of the interests of others. It is egotism, not egoism. On page 125 through the end of the chapter, Pincoffs turns to the evaluation and possible revision of personal ideals. He observes, personal ideals can be changed by personal decision. They can, the critic might say, be conjured away by the arbitrary decisions of individuals that they place themselves in as they are faced with the requirements of the ideal in practice. I have a set of ideals. Better, I have sets of personal ideals. They come lumped and clustered together. Those ideals are at my disposal. I am responsible for them. It is to my advantage to become aware of and articulate about my ideals. As I do so, I might decide that I no longer want to hold that ideal or set of ideals. I want to dispose of it entirely, modify it, or recontextualize it. I can do that. I can also, Pincoffs claims, decide some ideal or set of ideals I'm trying to live by is too difficult, misguided, or unpleasant in some other way, and set it aside altogether. This process of examining, rearranging, and pruning our ideals is something we do through acts of reasoning. We think about them and how they work. They evaluate one set of ideals in terms of other sets of ideals that we take to be more important or more central. We use our reason to discover when our ideals are wrong or misguided. He says explicitly on page 126 that our personal ideals must always be open to criticism on moral grounds, always liable to rejection as being immoral. We reason our way through the implications of our ideals because we can reason about all these things, about all these parts of the evaluative process. We are responsible for reasoning well. Pincoffs concludes this bit about assessing our ideals with the declaration that it does not follow that because an ideal is personal, it is immune to moral criticism. But neither does it follow that because a personal ideal can be morally criticized, it should not be taken into account in making one's decisions. Some ideal might now, in this setting, be immoral, but with changing settings, it could be perfectly accessible. That's acceptable. In the last few pages of the chapter, you see Pincoffs using the word Weltanschauung and the plural form Weltanschauungen. These are respectively the singular and plural forms of the German word for worldview. If you are a student of intellectual history, it's likely that you'll run into this word repeatedly, even if you're limited to reading books and articles in English. It's come over into English for use in certain academic disciplines. You'll likely not find it of much use among your friends and family, however. If you do try it out on them and find it useful, let me know.